Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here today for such an important conversation that really does impact all of us. In fact, I have seen firsthand through my reporting in so much of the developing world and conflict zones that when women are not treated equally or fairly, we all lose. And here is a very sober thought from the United Nations that it will likely take us, wait for it, 300 years to reach gender equality. In fact, just today, a couple of hours ago, the US Senate blocked an equal rights amendment. Not one single country in the world has reached gender parity, not even Canada. No pressure, Prime Minister Trudeau, but this interview is being live streamed across Canada, so.
We need more women to run for office, absolutely.
You're not going to get an argument from me. But I will say there's so much to cover domestically and internationally. But for the purposes of this spectacular summit, let's focus in on your perspective on where gender inequality and poverty, how do they connect? And what can countries like Canada and the United States and the developed world do to actually narrow the gap?
Well, one of the things that we're grappling with is this morning I was at the UN and we had a conversation around the Sustainable Development Goals and the path to 2030 and how important it is to bring the world forward in the right direction. And it's no surprise that as we're finding out that we are behind where we need to be on the SDGs in general, that's aligned with a backsliding of women's rights and women's empowerment around the world. Because if we want to build a better world, from everything from education to conflict to small businesses and economic empowerment to politics, we need to empower more women to be part of the solution, part of the conversation, and quite frankly, leading those solutions. And the fact that we're backsliding on that is linked to the fact that we're backsliding on absolutely everything else. So for me, the challenge around women's equality isn't just a problem, it's also the solution to the problem. And that's where Canada has been unequivocal about pushing women's equality both at home and around the world. When we hosted the G7 in 2018, we put forward $4 billion as a G7 for women and girls' education in crisis-specific areas. We're continuing to fight for reproductive rights. We're continuing to invest in women-led grassroots organizations around the world. There are so many more things we need to do because we don't get to fix the world unless women are not just part of it, but leading it.
There's so many things you've just said, and we're going to dig into all of that, but you've just talked about the backsliding, and Ambassador, I want to bring you in because certainly top of mind today in the last 12 days is Sudan. And I know that the first airlift of Canadians happened today, but the people left behind. And you have spent so much time and have so much experience with Sudan, and it seems like any progress that women made has just collapsed. So what now? How did we get here? And do they have to just sit and watch the men do their business until they move forward again?
Not an option, no. You know, what people hear mostly about Sudan are about two men, two generals fighting, and that's the source of the conflict. The untold story of Sudan is that there is a massive number of capable, talented women organizers. There's an extremely strong women's movement. They've taught me most of what I know about women, peace and security and the power of women. We don't hear about that a lot, but think about what Sudanese women have accomplished. They had a dictator for almost 30 years, and Sudanese women led the revolution that took him down. They were about 3/4 of demonstrators, women and young people. They fought in the streets, they have plans, they knew what they wanted afterwards. And then what happened in Sudan is similar to what happens in many places in the world, where those who are on the front lines get shut out of formal conversations, predominantly women, formal structures, formal governance, and the power just ends up getting redistributed by the same actors. And so women in Sudan have been talking for years, ever since the government fell, they've been talking about the problem of a bloated military, about paramilitaries, about different generals massing up troops and massing up their own forces, and they've called this as an issue. So they're going to keep organizing. They're organizing now. So a week after the fighting started, we got sent, as the international community, a statement signed by 20 different Sudanese women's organizations describing what was happening and saying exactly what they need. That's 7 days into a city under siege and massive conflict, and from across the country, including Darfur. So we just need to keep supporting Sudanese women, listening to them, making sure they're at the table, and not counting them out. And they don't have the luxury of giving up. They're not going to. I know that for a fact. And so we have to keep listening to them.
And you know, it's such a good point, because with so much global conflict, aid from the international community is even more important. And Prime Minister, I have to go at you on this point. Despite promises to increase international aid, in last month's federal budget, you actually cut it by 15%. And that is $1.3 billion that is just gone from the organizations that rely so heavily on it. And I just wonder, how, first of all, do you justify that?
Actually, in 2019 and before, we made commitments to increase every year our funding for women's aid, for humanitarian aid, and we absolutely have. Over the past year or two, we spent extra significant amounts because of the pandemic, because of the war in Ukraine, because of what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening elsewhere. So we spiked up tremendously, but the baseline continues to go. And what's more than that is every year, as we know, between now and the end of the year, unfortunately, other crises are going to bounce up that we didn't predict, that we didn't know about, and Canada will be stepping up for those, as we always do, as we did in the case of Ukraine and Afghanistan and the pandemic. So we are steadily continuing to increase our investments because that's a commitment we've made.
But with crises, I understand immediate funding, but I'm just going to speak for the aid organizations in Canada specifically, who they plan for these programs, and I've seen it firsthand, the groundbreaking work that they're doing with civil society, and when that money is taken out.
But they can still plan for the steady increases that we had in place from before 2019. We spiked it massively because of the pandemic, because of various crises that we had to respond to, and we will continue, as Canada always will, to be there as punctual crises, whether they be pandemics or other conflicts, we will continue to be there because we are committed to international assistance focused on empowering women and girls.
Just today, your government made an announcement on the renewal and expansion of Canada's women's voice and leadership. Tell us a little bit about that, first of all, and then also, does that signify an intent to, sorry, haven't had a microphone on in a while. I can hear it popping. My apologies. But does it signify an intent to go back in the direction of expanding foreign aid funding?
Like I said, we are expanding foreign aid funding. We will continue to at the steady pace that we set out. The Women's Voice and Leadership Program is something we created in 2017 with a hope to reach about 400 different organizations. And we designed it based on what we'd heard from grassroots women's organizations around the world, which is predictable, multi-year funding, core funding, not program funding, with full flexibility for how they use it, so they can actually rely on it and respond to whatever it is they need and they see as the needs, rather than us dictating what they should be doing. It was so successful that we reached more than 400. Over the past years, we've reached up to about 1,500 different organizations. So we're significantly expanding and increasing that to $195 million over the next 5 years, with ongoing funding as well, because we know that these kinds of initiatives defending women's rights from that grassroots community level, led by women, impacting other women, is one of the most powerful ways of actually effecting change. Not just give anything against those big organizations that are well established on delivering aid around the world, humanitarian. We all know them, they do a great job, but making sure that we are reaching out first and directly as well to those grassroots organizations that are women-led and not part of big global hierarchies is how you have the biggest impact on the ground, and that's what we've seen. That's why we're continuing to expand this program.
Ambassador, perhaps you can give us some real, nuts and bolts of the things the impact you have seen, specifically where this money goes and what change and outcomes it may have.
So as the Prime Minister said, the hallmark of this is listening to people telling us what they need and what they want to work on. So we're seeing a whole range of disparate impacts over 31 different countries. Some of the best stuff to hear about, we hear about organizations who use it to do things like a woman was talking about in the Caribbean. They used to provide support to domestic violence victims, meet them in parking lots. One of them talked about we used to have to meet at the Kentucky Fried Chicken. We actually have an office now. We can go to it. We provide funding, we provide temporary rent, et cetera. That's essential to hear. The stuff that I find also super exciting is they worked with other women's networks in the Caribbean to get past a domestic violence law. And for the first time, that law has provisions about cyber stalking, so that women saying this is a huge problem for us. And for the first time, same-sex couples can have access to legal recourse when they experience domestic violence. So they're organizing, they're providing services. We see that all the time. We've seen that since time immemorial. What some of this funding is doing is also giving space for organizing. Indigenous women in Peru, now they have networks of other Indigenous women. They're creating what they call sister spokespeople so that they can go on the radio and form their own Indigenous narratives about their countries. You know, in Bangladesh, women are talking about reintegrating back into their communities women who've been migrant workers and who've been sexually abused. So when they come home, how do we make sure that they're not lost in the system? So the results are really different, but what they're collectively doing is working on changing policy, working on changing the structure. So as the Prime Minister said, the system in which they work changes, and they're not dependent on the types of foreign aid that we're talking about. It's a system change.
The polar opposite of that, of course, is unfolding in Afghanistan, the most repressive place in the world. In fact, the only country in the world where girls, as we all know, are banned from an education, secondary and university. This is nothing short of gender apartheid on our watch. So you say, well, what can countries do? And I look at what Denmark is doing, Finland, automatic refugee status for women and girls based solely on their gender. And I wonder why Canada isn't following suit and other countries of the world to do what we can for these women who literally are in their basements hiding.
Well, Canada has actually stepped up as one of the most generous countries in terms of welcoming in refugees from Afghanistan. We have a goal of 40,000. We know how important it is to welcome people fleeing from violence, fleeing from the range of horrors that they're facing in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. Canada has always been there on refugees, and we will continue to. The challenge in Afghanistan right now is largely getting people out of it to safety. We're continuing to work with that. Canada, like so many other countries, sacrificed an awful lot over the past decades to fight for women's education and girls' education in Afghanistan. So it's absolutely heartbreaking to see this, and we're always looking for good ideas. We're always looking to do more.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm specifically pointing to those two countries, because as long as these women have a visa, they get to the Kabul airport and they can get out. So I just wonder, is there more that you're exploring? I think we're up to 30,000 Afghans who are now in Canada, but I'm talking specifically targeted automatic refugee status.
We did target specifically women human rights defenders in Afghanistan, and different countries do different things. I can tell you we are actually bringing in a lot more refugees, including a lot more women from Afghanistan than those two countries are.
Well, okay.
You know, there's all different programs, and we'll look at more. We're always looking to do more.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not going to make policy here with you, but it's a great idea, and we'll keep moving forward.
I will say Afghanistan is the extreme example. And Ambassador, I want to get your opinion, first of all. There feels like there is such a pushback right now on women's rights, and it's really hard not to despair, whether it is Afghanistan or name the country, actually. Why do you believe we are seeing this reversal of gains that were made?
Well, you said it feels like it. It feels like it, and there is a reversal of gains. We see it at the international level, at forums like the UN, and women talk about it constantly at a country level and an individual level. So it's very real, and many people have been experiencing it for a very long time. Sometimes what we call a crisis is something that people have, it's not new to them, so they've been dealing with it. I think that it's happening for a number of reasons. I think people are trying to retain power and trying to hold on to power. And autocrats, authoritarians, populists, they're scared of being held accountable by their own people. And that includes strong women who are urging them to share power, to be less corrupt, to be more transparent. So a lot of this is based in hoarding power, being afraid of losing it, and wanting to amass more of it. They're also trying to disrupt kind of traditional partnerships and alliances that we have, and trying to prevent countries like Canada from working in real, authentic partnership with other countries. One of the most ridiculous narratives that exists on this, and this is being promoted very actively by some parties, is that this concept of gender equality and women's rights was invented by the West and is being imposed by the West.
Let's name names, though, because you're very specific on...
Oh, it's Russia and China
So-
specifically. Yeah. It's my job to name names.
No, but I want to know
Jackie's
more
the diplomat.
So give us another sentence on that. Russia and China.
Well, we are seeing. Sorry,
No.
Jackie. Well, you just. Okay, I'll say it quickly, and then you can. We are seeing a deliberate attempt to undermine the march towards democracy, the fight that so many women are leading around the world on anti-corruption, on democracy, on sharing power, on responsible governance, on education and empowering a range of voices. Women are leading those fights somewhere, and the authoritarian governments that count on rigid, hierarchical, patriarchal control in so many cases are threatened by that, and their allies and spheres of influence are threatened by that. So by saying that this is a Western construct, they're playing a nationalist card, an identity card, in a way that further disempowers the local women who are standing up for their rights in their ways. And that's why we're very careful with programs like Women's Voice and Leadership to make sure it's very clear we are empowering the women who are already doing things and just giving them the tools to continue to have the leadership that they need to show.
I'd love to hear what Russian and Chinese women would have to say to that concept as
We
well.
have a lot to say about it. I mean, a prime example is this area that I focus on, this concept of women, peace, and security, the idea that women deserve and need to have voices in decisions that affect their lives. That's the essence of it. There are conversations led by Russia, China, and others saying, this is a Western idea, it's imposed. This whole existence came after women have literally for thousands of years been organizing in communities. Indigenous women's leadership. The idea that this came out of the West is not only inaccurate, it's deeply offensive to women who've been organizing in communities forever. Women went to the Beijing Forum on Women's Congress 25 years ago, 40,000 of them. They said this is not a side issue, it's not a separate issue. We have to take this to the Security Council. So they got Bangladesh to bring it up, Namibia to support, Jamaica, and very proudly Canada as well. This exists, this whole space exists because of grassroots women's leadership and women in conflict saying, like women in Sudan are saying, we deliver services, we are essential to this community, we can't be shut out. So this narrative is something that we're constantly fighting, and we fight it by by listening and by making sure that women just have the space to say what they need to say. I always say, if I may, it's a pointed comment, I often say women don't need to be given a voice, they have a voice, we just need to listen to it.
But also the idea, and I think there's a lot of women in the West who would point out that it's not particularly a Western construct either. We're not doing a very good job in our own countries around standing up for women's rights. So the idea that we'd be imposing something that we are not good enough at is a further illustration of Russia and China's.
That you just brought up a great point, because above war and conflict, women are also, most importantly, victims of sexual violence. For gender equality, sexual and reproductive health and rights are essential. And I know that this is something, so much in the news right now, but I wonder how concerned you are about women's reproductive rights internationally. And I ask that here in the United States, where we are seeing access to abortion continue to roll back, including access to the abortion pill.
Well, first of all, the most recent Supreme Court judgment is for me and for many of us, a reflection, oh my God, when do we get to stop having to relitigate this every time? I mean, it's still, women are still having to fight up for, stand up for basic rights that should have been and have been recognized long ago, and that seeing that backsliding, and it's, yes, the United States is obviously big challenges, but it's true in every country. In Canada, we're continuing to yes, we're a pro-choice government. We are unequivocal about that. We've expanded access to abortion pills, which really matters for people in rural and remote areas. But even in Canada, an American president had to admonish half of our House of Commons in Parliament to stand up and applaud when we were talking about women's rights, because there's still a big debate around a woman's right to choose, around women's rights, around to us LGBTQI plus rights in Canada. There is no place where we're not seeing attacks on rights that one would have hoped we could be taking for granted now, but we're understanding you do not get to take these things for granted, and we need to continue to be standing up and fighting every step of the way. And a big part of these conversations have to be men. We have to do it. I was pleased when President Biden was standing up for women's rights in the Canadian Parliament. Guys, men have to have conversations with their boys. I have a 15-year-old son who spends too much time on the internet, and I know the kinds of things that are out there, the sneaky misogynism that sort of slips through in workout videos and bro videos. Having those conversations are way more difficult for me than having just the basic birds and the bees conversations. Anyone talk about birds and bees anymore in this era of too much information on the internet? But having those difficult conversations now about women's rights, about equality, about these things that are core to how boys are raised, this is something that men have to be better allies on and part of, and that is something that we will continue to be pushing in Canada and everywhere around the world.
Absolutely true. I mean, women can't do it alone. But another tough question, though, on the money front, this is a priority for you, and we look at sexual and reproductive health rights. Of the 700 million, and I don't want to get this wrong, annual target for women's health, this is your own government data, only 104 million per year has been spent. Why the holdup?
Oh, there's obviously more to do. I don't know the details behind those numbers, but I do know that we have put a tremendous emphasis on ensuring that the provincial governments which deliver health care in our country are delivering the full range of reproductive health services in an inclusive way. And we have regularly held back funding transfers to our provinces that haven't been delivering on those things, and we will continue to do that. We will continue to make sure we're stepping up more.
You know, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to just ask both of you, and for everybody in the room and everybody watching, it is not as if we are immobile as human beings. There are things we can do. Ambassador, give us your view on what the average person in their home can do to try to better the world in general.
In the spirit of starting with yourself, I always urge us to do a self-audit of our information sources. So think about your social media feeds, who you're following on Twitter, who you're following on Instagram. Are you following women? Are you following women from the Global South? Are you following local journalists, women from a range of communities? How homogenous or not is your Indigenous feed? Is your Twitter feed? If you're a student or a teacher, audit your curriculum. Do all of the sources of authority, the authors, do they look like each other? How different are they? Are they from the community that they're writing about? Are they talking about? Do that audit. And audit your news sources. If I can end with just one last point back to Sudan. About a week before the conflict broke out in Sudan, there was a news story in the New York Times about the mood in Khartoum. It was a pretty long feature, pictures, etc. There was not one single woman quoted, not one referenced, and not one woman even shown in the 7 pictures that were associated, except there was one example in which the journalist was interviewing a man in the dark because the power had been cut, and his unnamed wife came by. She had procured a jerry can full of fuel that they used for the generator to turn on the lights for the interview. That was the mood in Khartoum, was a feature entirely about men and the mood among men. Question that, challenge that, push back on the outlets, find other journalists, and just start with yourself and recognize, who am I giving the power to? Who am I viewing as an authority on this? And challenge yourself.
So they're doing the heavy lifting in the background. Prime Minister, global citizens watching today, they want to see more steps like the announcement made today. And in a recent Abacus poll shows that nearly 2/3 of Canadians say it is important that Canada continue investing in support of developing countries and human rights. Does that entice you to rethink cuts or encourage you? What's your takeaway from the fact that 2/3 of Canadians want this?
I think, first of all, that is great news. It is really important in this era of polarization, of nationalism, Canada first, America first, wherever you have it first, that we see that Canadians continue to understand perhaps that lesson that we all learned through the pandemic and through climate change challenges, that what happens at home is directly impacted, no matter how wealthy or insulated you feel, from what happens on the other side of the world. And that understanding, that awareness that we are all deeply connected in everything we do now, in everything that happens to us, is a very, very positive sign. And that's why our government is going to continue to step up and increase our humanitarian aid, increase our focus on women, increase our focus on empowering local grassroots women's organizations, because that is where the biggest changes at the ground and the Canadian taxpayer dollars can be leveraged the furthest for real, tangible impact around the world that's going to leave us better off in generations to come.
And I know aid organizations, as always, will hold you accountable to the promises. And I thank you, Prime Minister and Ambassador. It's been really my honor to talk to you today on, as I say, this subject that is so important to all of us. So thanks to all of you, and that's it.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde.